Nobody talks about the real engine of the Mexican economy. Not the oil. Not the manufacturing. Not the tourists spending dollars in Cancun or Los Cabos. The real engine is something that does not appear in any government budget, does not get discussed in any central bank meeting, and does not generate a single headline in the financial press unless something goes wrong with it. It is the money that Mexican workers in the United States send home every month. Remittances. $63 billion in 2023 alone. That number needs to sit for a moment because it is almost impossible to process at first. $63 billion sent from Mexican workers in American cities and fields and construction sites and restaurants and warehouses back to families in Oaxaca and Michoacán and Guerrero and Zacatecas. More than Mexico earns from oil. More than Mexico earns from tourism. More than Mexico receives in foreign direct investment. The single largest source of foreign income in the entire Mexican economy, and it comes not from a corporation or a government program or a trade agreement but from millions of individual workers making individual decisions to send $200 home to their mothers at the end of every month. To understand what this means, you have to understand where the money goes and what it does when it gets there. It does not go to Mexico City. It does not go to Monterrey or Guadalajara or the industrial corridors of the north. It goes to the places that the formal Mexican economy has never reached, the small towns in the Sierra Madre, the villages in the Mixteca, the communities in rural Michoacán where the nearest bank branch is 2 hours away by unpaved road and where the only economic activity that exists is subsistence farming and the monthly Western Union transfer from a son or daughter in Los Angeles or Chicago or Atlanta. In these communities, remittances are not supplementary income. They are the economy. They are what pays the rent and buys the food and keeps the children in school and covers the medical bills and builds the new room on the house and funds the quinceañera and buries the dead. The Mexican government has a program called 3x1 for migrants that matches remittance money sent for community infrastructure projects. For every peso sent by a migrant collective for a road or a water system or a school, federal, state, and municipal governments each add 1 peso. It is an acknowledgement, written into policy, that the Mexican state cannot fund the development of its own rural communities without leveraging the money that its emigrants send from abroad. The workers in Houston and Denver are doing the job that the Mexican government cannot or will not do. The geography of remittances maps almost perfectly onto the geography of Mexican emigration, which maps almost perfectly onto the geography of poverty and agricultural collapse. Michoacán receives more remittances than almost any other state in Mexico. It is also one of the states with the highest emigration rates and one of the states most severely affected by the collapse of small-scale agriculture that followed NAFTA in 1994. When NAFTA opened the Mexican market to subsidized American corn, the price of corn in Mexico collapsed. Small farmers in Michoacán and Oaxaca and Guerrero who had been growing corn for generations could not compete with Iowa corn prices. They stopped farming. They left. They went to the United States. And then they sent the money back. The same trade agreement that destroyed subsistence agriculture in rural Mexico created the conditions for the remittance economy that now sustains those same rural communities. It is one of the more remarkable and underreported ironies in the history of North American economic integration. Zacatecas is another state where the remittance economy has created something genuinely unusual. Zacatecas has been sending workers to the United States since the Bracero program of the 1940s and 1950s, when the American and Mexican governments created a formal guest worker arrangement to supply agricultural labor to California and the Southwest. The Bracero program ended in 1964, but the migration networks it created did not. Families in Zacatecas have been sending members north for 80 years. The result is a state where entire towns have a dual existence, a physical presence in Zacatecas and a demographic shadow in Chicago or Los Angeles or Dallas where the younger generation lives and works and sends money home. Some Zacatecan towns have more former residents living in the United States than current residents living in Mexico. The hometown associations that Zacatecan migrants formed in American cities, the Clubes de Oriundos, became sophisticated enough to negotiate directly with the Mexican government on infrastructure investment, bypassing the state bureaucracy entirely and building roads and water systems and community centers with remittance money in the 3x1 match. migrants became a de facto development agency for their own communities of origin. The mechanics of how the money moves are themselves a story of technological and financial innovation that rarely gets the attention it deserves. In the 1990s, sending money from the United States to Mexico was expensive and slow. Western Union and MoneyGram charged fees of 10 to 15% of the transfer amount, which meant that a worker sending $200 home was losing $20 to $30 in fees before the money even crossed the border. The remittance industry was extracting billions of dollars annually from one of the most economically vulnerable populations in North America. Then technology changed the equation. Digital remittance platforms, Remitly, Wise, Xoom, and a dozen others, entered the market and drove fees down to 1 or 2%. Mobile banking penetration in Mexico improved dramatically through the 2010s. The cost of sending $200 from Dallas to Michoacán fell from $30 to $2 in less than a decade. That reduction in fees is not a small thing. Across $63 billion of annual transfers, the difference between a 10% fee and a 2% fee is $5 billion a year staying in the hands of workers and their families rather than going to financial intermediaries. $5 billion annually flowing into rural Mexican communities that would otherwise not see it. The businesses that have grown up around the remittance economy are another layer of the story that rarely gets told. In the sending communities, meaning the Mexican neighborhoods of Los Angeles and Chicago and Houston and New York, an entire ecosystem of businesses exists to serve the needs of workers who are maintaining economic and social ties across the border. Remittance agencies, now mostly operating as apps on phones but still present as physical storefronts in Mexican neighborhoods for the older generation that does not trust the digital systems. International calling plans. Shipping services that send packages from American cities to Mexican towns, boxes full of clothing and electronics and goods that are either unavailable or prohibitively expensive in Mexico. Travel agencies specializing in the seasonal return trips that Mexican workers make for Christmas and for the hometown festivals that remain central to community identity even across 1,000 miles of distance. Notaries and immigration lawyers and accountants who understand the particular financial and legal situation of people who live in two countries simultaneously. In the receiving communities, meaning the towns and cities of rural Mexico where remittance money arrives, the economic effects are complex and not uniformly positive even if the net impact is clearly necessary. The inflow of dollars into local economies that are otherwise peso-denominated creates inflation in the prices of local goods and real estate. Houses in high immigration towns in Michoacán and Zacatecas cost more than houses in economically similar towns with lower immigration rates, because remittance money has bid up prices beyond what local wages can support. This means that the families who do not have a member in the United States, who did not make the migration decision or could not afford to make it, find themselves in a more expensive local economy without the dollar income to match. The remittance economy creates a two-tier local economy in which connection to the United States is the dividing line between relative prosperity and genuine hardship. The dependency question is the one that Mexican economists and policymakers argue about most. $63 billion of annual remittances is not a foundation for development. It is a transfer payment, a way of sustaining consumption in communities that the formal economy cannot reach, but it does not by itself create the productive capacity that would allow those communities to generate their own income. A family that receives $3,000 a year in remittances can eat and send its children to school and build a better house. But it cannot build a factory or start a business or develop the agricultural or industrial capacity that would make it economically self-sufficient if the remittances stopped. The remittance economy solves the immediate problem of poverty without solving the underlying problem of underdevelopment. It keeps people alive and relatively stable in places that the Mexican state has not figured out how to develop, which is enormously important and genuinely insufficient at the same time. The political dimension of the remittance economy is almost entirely ignored in American public debate about immigration, which is remarkable given how central it should be to that debate. When American politicians discuss Mexican immigration, they discuss it almost exclusively in terms of its costs and benefits to the United States. The labor market effects, the fiscal effects, the cultural effects, the security effects. What they almost never discuss is the macroeconomic function that Mexican workers in the United States are performing for the Mexican economy, and therefore for Mexican political stability. $63 billion a year flowing into rural Mexican communities is one of the primary reasons that those communities have not collapsed entirely, that the Mexican countryside has not generated the kind of mass social instability that extreme poverty and agricultural collapse have generated in other parts of Latin America and the world. The workers who cross the border and send money home are not just supporting their families. They are subsidizing the social stability of a country of 130 million people that shares a 2,000-mile border with the United States. The remittance economy is, in a very real sense, American foreign policy being conducted by individual workers without anyone in Washington having decided to conduct it. The 2020 pandemic made all of this visible in a way that nothing had before. When the American economy shut down in March and April of 2020, the first prediction of every economist who studied remittances was that the flows would collapse. Workers who lost their jobs would have nothing to send. The remittance economy would contract sharply, adding economic crisis to the public health crisis already devastating rural Mexico. The prediction was wrong. Remittances to Mexico in 2020 did not fall. They rose. By the end of the year, despite the pandemic, despite mass unemployment in the American service sector where many Mexican workers were concentrated, remittances to Mexico had reached a new record. The explanation that emerged from subsequent research was that Mexican workers, facing the uncertainty of the pandemic, sent more money home not less, drawing down savings and cutting their own consumption in the United States to make sure their families in Mexico were protected. The pandemic revealed something that the economists' models had not fully captured, which is that remittances are not primarily an economic behavior. They are a family behavior. They are what people do for the people they love when those people are in another country and there is no other way to help them. That is the secret economy. Not secret because anyone is hiding it. Secret because it is so large and so fundamental and so completely woven into the daily lives of millions of people on both sides of the border that it has become invisible through familiarity. $63 billion a year moving from American cities to Mexican villages in transfers of $200 and $300 and $500, sent by people working double shifts in restaurants and construction sites and warehouses and fields, maintaining families and communities in a country across a border that politicians treat as a wall and workers treat as a line they cross because there is work on one side and family on the other and they have figured out how to be present in both places simultaneously.